15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. We have a liftoff.
NASA's Apollo program took human beings beyond low Earth orbit to the unexplored terrain of the moon. It was one of the most amazing accomplishments in the history of mankind, and it all began with John F. Kennedy's famous "We Choose to Go to the Moon" speech delivered on May 25, 1961 at Rice University in Houston, Texas.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too.
The main overarching goal of the Apollo program was to beat the Russians to the moon. The entire space race originated from a need for America to show its superiority over the Soviet Union, and its culminating project was Apollo. We spoke with Bill Anders, who is one of the Apollo 8 astronauts. He gave us some insights into the Apollo program.
Apollo was a program to show the Soviets, the rest of the world, and America, that America wasn't second rate. That even though the Soviets had beaten us in almost every event in space, we now had done something that they didn't even try to do.
To get to the moon, Congress created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or as it's more commonly known as NASA. Until this time, the Air Force was conducting the majority of the United States space projects. The agency's first project was Mercury, which was to provide the U.S. with its first experience with humans in space. It began in 1958, and its goal was to put an American in space. Overall, the mission was very successful, and we learned about man's capabilities in the space environment. Unfortunately, the Russians beat the United States by putting the first man in space.
Next came Gemini, a program designed to test the skills and technology necessary to get people to the moon. First, they needed to have longer duration missions. Second, they needed to be able to rendezvous in space. And third, they needed safe re-entry of a spacecraft. This further progressed the technology needed to achieve a moon landing.
To get out of the Earth's gravity and to the moon, NASA built the most powerful rocket that has ever flown successfully, the Saturn V. It was a towering 363 feet tall, about the height of a 36-story tall building. Fully fueled for liftoff, the Saturn V weighed 6.2 million pounds, the weight of about 400 elephants. The rocket generated 7.6 million pounds of thrust, creating more power than 85 Hoover dams. It could launch 130 tons into Earth orbit and launch 50 tons to the moon.
The Apollo missions began with tragedy. On January 27, 1967, just before launch of Apollo 1, a fire broke out in the command module. The 3 astronauts inside died in this accident. A comprehensive investigation was conducted that led to major changes that increased the overall safety of the command module, service module, and the lunar module. The next 2 scheduled launches were scrubbed after the fire. Apollo 4 was on November 9, 1967, and was the first unmanned test flight of Saturn V. Apollo 5, on January 22, 1968, tested the lunar module, specifically for descent and ascent. Apollo 6, on April 4, 1968, was the second test run of the Saturn V rocket. Apollo 7, on October 11, 1968, was the first manned Earth orbital demonstration of the Apollo program, and included the first live television broadcast from a manned mission in space. Apollo 8 flew from December 21st to 27th, 1968, and was conducted by astronauts Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders. It was the first mission to ever go to the moon. It also brought back one of the most important photos of the 20th century, Earthrise.
NASA decided that Apollo 8 would move to the first flight on the manned Saturn V to the moon and go into orbit around it. It took about 2.5 days to get to the moon. So after we went into lunar orbit, I saw out of the window the Earth. Camera with color film and a long lens that started blazing away at the Earth. That picture was one of the major accomplishments of Apollo 8. Because we went all the way to the moon, studied the moon, what we discovered was the Earth.
Apollo 9 flew from March 3rd to 13th, 1969. This mission ultimately demonstrated the portable life support system to be used on the moon, and it was the first manned flight of the Command Service Module and Lunar Module in Earth orbit. Apollo 10 flew from May 18th to May 26, 1969. It was conducted by astronauts Thomas Stafford, John Young, and Eugene Cernan. This mission primarily served as a rehearsal for the first lunar landing. The lunar module flew down about 15 kilometers above the lunar surface before coming back up to the command module.
The most important and most famous of the Apollo missions was Apollo 11. It began at the Kennedy Space Center at 9:32 a.m. on Wednesday, July 16, 1969, with the launch of Saturn V. Its goal to transport Neil Armstrong, Edwin "Buzz" Aldrin, and Michael Collins to the moon, where Neil and Buzz would land on its surface and plant the American flag. On July 20, 1969, after a 4-day trip, the Apollo astronauts arrived at the moon. The lunar module, Eagle, carrying Neil and Buzz, separated from the command module, Columbia, leaving Michael Collins in orbit around the moon. On July 20, 1969, Neil Armstrong became the first human to set foot on the moon.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
An estimated 1/5 of the population of the world watched the live transmission of the Apollo 11 moonwalk. After lifting off from the lunar surface, the lunar module made its rendezvous with the command module. The Eagle docked with Columbia, and the lunar samples were brought aboard. The lunar module was left behind in lunar orbit while the 3 astronauts returned to the command module and began their journey back to Earth. The final phase of Kennedy's challenge was completed at 12:50 p.m. Eastern Time on July 24, 1969, when the Columbia splashed down about 812 miles southeast of Hawaii, returning the 3 astronauts safely to Earth.
President Richard Nixon said, quote, "This is the greatest week in the history of the world since all of creation." The flight of Apollo 11 met an ecstatic reaction around the globe as everyone shared in the success of the astronauts. The front pages of newspapers everywhere suggested how strong the enthusiasm was. NASA estimated that because of the nearly worldwide radio and television coverage, more than a half of the population of the planet was aware of the events of Apollo 11. The United States proved once and for all that it was a first-class nation, and proved to the world, especially the Soviet Union, that they were a force to be reckoned with.
The Soviets were equally deflated as we were inflated, and so they were humiliated and basically gave up their lunar landing program.
After the overwhelming success of Apollo 11, the program continued its legacy with the missions that followed. Apollo 12 made its flight November 14th to 24th, 1969. This was the second time humans landed on the moon. The unforgettable Apollo 13 made its flight April 11th to 17th, 1970. An explosion in one of the oxygen tanks crippled the spacecraft during flight, and the crew were forced to orbit the moon and return to Earth without land. The world looked on with horror as the events unfolded. NASA engineers worked around the clock to come up with a solution so the astronauts would not run out of air. Thankfully, they all made it back alive. Apollo 14 flew January 31st to February 9th, 1971. Aboard this mission were astronauts Alan Shepard, Stuart Roosa, and Edgar Mitchell. This was the 3rd time humans landed on the moon. Apollo 15 made its flight from July 26 to August 7, 1971. Astronauts David Scott, Alfred Worden, and James Irwin were aboard this mission. This was the first extended lunar module and rover to land. Apollo 16 flew April 16 to 27, 1972. It was manned by astronauts John Young, T. Kenneth Mattingly, and Charles Duke. Apollo 17 flew December 7 to 19, 1972. Aboard this final Apollo mission were Eugene Cernan, Ronald Evans, and Harrison Schmitt. The mission was the only Saturn V night launch and the final manned moon landing.
The Apollo program has been called the greatest technological achievement in human history. Technology developed by NASA scientists routinely made its way into products developed in robotics, computer hardware, software, nanotechnology, aeronautics, transportation, and healthcare. With over 6,300 innovations used today, many technology developments from the Apollo program have greatly impacted America. Innovations such as smoke detectors, cordless tools, computer microchips, and many more were made during the Apollo program.
The Apollo program cost the U.S. an estimated $176 billion from 1962 to 1972. Only a little more than 50% of Americans actually wanted to continue going to the moon, especially after the Vietnam War began.
President Kennedy started the Apollo program and the race to the moon as a Cold War gambit, a way to demonstrate the superiority of a free, democratic way of life, in contrast to our communist adversaries. The Apollo program had a significant effect, ending the Cold War as soon as possible.
The Apollo program left behind the perception of Earth as a fragile, small planet, captured in photographs taken by the astronauts during the lunar missions. The 24 astronauts who traveled to the moon are the only humans to have observed the Earth from beyond low Earth orbit, and have traveled farther from Earth than anyone else to this day. The Apollo program set the standard for a new era in space travel. For Americans, reaching the moon has instilled an unconquerable will to explore depths beyond the moon.
It is quite undeniable that the Apollo program signaled one of the greatest glories for humanity. Apollo laid the foundation for many new technologies and knowledge that will help advance humans as a species. Implications of the Apollo program have now pushed technology towards new and greater endeavors, such as the journey to Mars. For Americans, Apollo has signaled more than a foundation for new technology or defeat of the Soviets. It demonstrated the American will to challenge the impossible, to push the limits, and to persevere through the daunting obstacles that face us. To this day, no one can or ever will take America's most profound accomplishment of being the first to set foot on an entity outside of our own planet.